You grew up in a world where seatbelts were optional, not a habit. You sat in the back seat, or sometimes the front, as cigarette smoke drifted quietly through a slightly open window. The melodies of Fleetwood Mac or Eagles played from an old radio, like a soundtrack to a time when anxiety didn't seem to exist yet. No one called it neglect, because back then, people simply believed that everything would turn out fine. But that very normalcy, that mix of freedom and unconsciousness, quietly etched itself into your mind, shaping how you face risk, how you understand safety, and even how you love. In this video, we'll unravel, through the lens of psychology, the invisible imprints that the 1970s left on who you are today, things you may have never named, but have always felt. If these words resonate with you, hit subscribe and stay until the end of the video, because what comes next might make you see your own childhood in a completely different way. But there is a deeper psychological layer that many people who lived through the 1970s often don't recognize until they pause and look back at themselves. The way you learn to survive in a world that didn't explain everything to you. You weren't taught how to name your emotions. There were no long conversations about mental health. No one asked you, "Are you okay?" in the way we've grown used to today. Instead, you learned to read the room. You watched the eyes of adults, the way they closed doors hard or gently, the silence between two sentences. And from that, you figured everything out on your own. From the perspective of John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, children don't just need the presence of their parents, but also consistent emotional responses. But when you grew up in a time when adults themselves were struggling with their own lives, that consistency simply didn't always exist. And you adapted. You didn't ask for more. You became easy to raise, mature, not troublesome. Those compliments sound positive, but behind them is often a child who learned to shrink their needs to fit the situation. What's interesting is that when you enter adulthood, those very adaptive mechanisms become a double-edged sword. You may be extremely reliable at work. You handle crises better than most people. You don't panic when things don't go as planned. But at the same time, you may struggle to allow yourself to be vulnerable. You're not used to needing anyone. And when someone genuinely wants to get close to you, you may feel uncomfortable. Not because you don't want connection, but because a part of you has been programmed to believe that dependence always comes with risk. This is where the research of E. Mavis Hetherington becomes especially important. She didn't just point out that children from broken families may face difficulties, but also emphasized that many of them develop remarkable adaptability. They don't break, they become flexible. But that flexibility sometimes comes at the cost of an internal sense of safety. And then there is a very striking paradox. You are both highly independent and highly sensitive. You can handle most situations on your own, yet you are easily affected by subtle shifts in other people's emotions. This is not accidental. As a child, you had to rely on observation to understand the world, so your brain developed strong abilities in detecting social signals. You know when someone is not okay, even if they don't say it. You can sense tension in the air. But the price of that sensitivity is that you tend to carry other people's emotions as if they were your responsibility. This is a subtle manifestation of what many psychologists call hyperempathy, a survival skill that was once very useful, but not always healthy in adult relationships. At the same time, the experience of unsupervised freedom in the 1970s also left a very distinct imprint. Unlike later generations who grew up with packed schedules and constant supervision, you had long stretches of time that completely belonged to you. You had to decide for yourself where to go, who to play with, and what to do when things went wrong. According to the research of Peter Gray, this kind of free play helps children develop self-regulation, independent thinking, and social skills in a natural way. You didn't need adults to step in and resolve every conflict. You learned how to negotiate, compromise, and sometimes accept failure. This creates a kind of adult who isn't overly afraid of making mistakes. You understand that things don't always come with clear instructions, and that is normal. However, that freedom also comes with a form of loneliness that not everyone recognizes. When no one is watching you, it also means no one truly knows what you're going through. You can have an entire inner world that no one ever touches. And over time, you get used to keeping everything to yourself. You don't always know how to share, not because you don't want to, but because you were never taught how to do it safely. This is why many people from this generation may find it difficult to talk about deep emotions, even with those they trust. Finally, it's impossible to ignore the broader cultural context that surrounded your childhood. Events like the Vietnam War or the Watergate scandal were not just news on TV. They created a shared psychological atmosphere, a sense that the world is not entirely trustworthy, that large systems can fail, and that certainty is rare. You didn't need to fully understand what was happening to be affected by it. You just needed to live in that atmosphere. And over time, this nurtured a very particular kind of skepticism. You don't easily trust completely, but you're not entirely pessimistic either. You observe, you wait, you keep just enough distance to protect yourself, but not so much that you lose connection. All of these elements come together to form a very distinct identity. Someone who can endure, adapt, and read the world with subtlety, but sometimes forgets how to return to themselves. And perhaps the greatest value of looking back is not to change the past, but to finally understand that many things you've always thought were just who you are actually just what you had to learn in order to survive. But there is a deeper psychological consequence that is rarely spoken about directly. When you grow up in an era where trust in large systems gradually declines, you don't just learn to question the world, you also learn to rely on smaller, more certain things. You don't fully trust institutions, not because you want to resist them, but because your lived experience has taught you that certainty does not always come from the outside. The upheavals of the time, such as the Vietnam War or the Watergate scandal, didn't just change politics, they changed the collective sense of trustworthiness. And when a child grows up in that atmosphere, trust is no longer the default. It becomes something that must be verified through personal experience. This creates a very distinct psychological pattern. You are not easily persuaded by words, but you are extremely attuned to actions. You don't need someone to make many promises. You simply observe whether they are there when it matters. And because of that, when you form a bond with someone, that bond carries a very different weight. It is not built on constant affirmations, but on quiet, consistent moments. This is why many people who grew up in this period often have relationships that last for decades, not because they don't change, but because they deeply understand the value of staying. From the perspective of Dan McAdams, human beings construct a narrative identity, the way we understand ourselves through the stories we tell about our lives. And for those who grew up amid instability, those stories are rarely simple. They contain contradictions, gaps, and parts that cannot be fully explained. But that very complexity creates a unique depth. You don't need a perfect story to feel that you have value. You accept that life can be both beautiful and confusing at the same time. And that acceptance is not weakness, it is a rare form of maturity. There is a notable paradox here. You are both skeptical and loyal. You don't trust easily, but once you do, you go all the way. This can sometimes confuse others. They may see you keep your distance at first, but once that boundary is crossed, you become one of the most steadfast people they have ever known. This is not accidental. When you grow up in an environment where everything can change at any moment, you learn to appreciate what remains, and that appreciation becomes the foundation for how you build relationships. In addition, becoming familiar with uncertainty from an early age gives you a unique ability. You don't need everything to be clear right away. While many people feel anxious without answers, you can sit with questions. You don't panic when the future is uncertain. This can be linked to the observations of Peter Gray on how children develop when given the freedom to explore. They learn to trust the process rather than focusing only on outcomes. And you, in a way, have carried that skill into adulthood. You don't need to control everything to feel okay. You just need to know that you can adapt when necessary. However, like the earlier parts, this strength comes with a subtle cost. When you are too used to handling everything on your own, you may unintentionally make others feel unnecessary. You don't ask for much, you don't complain, you don't demand attention, and that can sometimes make others think you don't need them. But that's not the truth. You were simply never taught that needing someone can be safe. This is one of the most common emotional blind spots. You long for deep connection, yet don't always know how to open up to receive it. What's important is that once you begin to recognize these patterns, you also begin to have a choice. You can keep what made you strong, your independence, adaptability, and loyalty, while learning to loosen the defensive mechanisms that are no longer necessary. You can allow yourself to be supported without feeling weak. You can share without fearing that you are being a burden. And most importantly, you can rewrite your own story, not by rejecting the past, but by understanding it more fully. Because if there is one thing your generation has done remarkably well, it is moving forward even without a clear map. You don't need everything to be perfect to begin. You don't need absolute certainty to trust. You just need enough experience to know that you can handle whatever comes next. And in an increasingly complex world, that is not just a personality trait, it is an advantage. So when you look back at everything you've been through, you may realize for the first time that what you once thought of as guardedness, silence, or excessive independence were actually survival strategies that helped you get to where you are today. And when you understand that, you are no longer bound by them. You can keep your resilience while also opening up to another version of yourself, one that not only knows how to survive, but truly allows itself to connect, trust, and live more fully.